Happy New Year again, and thank you for joining us. My name is Karen Corman, and I have the privilege of being the Executive Director of the UIC Alumni Association. Welcome to the UIC Alumni Exchange Series. We have a great lineup planned for you in 2021. And whether this is your first Alumni Exchange program, or your fifth or your 10th, we continue to work hard to bring you a variety of programs and topics so you can explore, connect, and even escape from the everyday with a community of UIC faculty, staff, and alumni experts. You'll hear me say this just a few times today, but I encourage you to visit go.uic.edu/alumni exchange for the latest and the greatest programming. And with that, I'm excited to start our program this afternoon, featuring UIC College of Applied Health Sciences, Professor Dr. Krista Virdi. As a top researcher on intermittent fasting, Dr. Virdi will talk us through the different forms of this diet, how safe it is, and how it leads to weight loss, and how it can lower diabetes and heart risk disease. Thank you, Dr. Virdi, for being with us today, and I'll turn it over to you to begin the program.
Oh, great. Well, thank you so much for having me here today. As she mentioned, I've been studying intermittent fasting for the past 15 years or so now. So I actually started studying it like way before it even got popular. I know it got popular probably in the past like 2 to 3 years, but yeah, I started studying this actually in animal models during my postdoc at UC Berkeley. And yeah, we found that it kind of worked wonders in mice. So we wanted to see, well, yeah, does it actually also work in human subjects? So let me just see. Sorry. Okay. So before I get into all the nitty gritties of kind of the results and all the data, the thing I do want to first talk about is kind of some of the definitions with intermittent fasting. I know it's really confusing since it's become popular. There's a lot of like terminology thrown around. But the main thing that I wanted to go over was that intermittent fasting itself is an umbrella term for three different types of diets. So the first type of intermittent fasting is called alternate day fasting. And alternate day fasting is kind of, I'd say it's probably the second most popular one. And it's when you have a fast day that alternates with something called a feast day. So on that fast day, you can choose to have just water. So some people just like to do straight up water the whole day, which is admittedly kind of tough. Or you alternatively, you can have about 500 or 600 calories on that day. That's kind of like, I'd say it's kind of like a medium sized lunch. So like a sandwich and a side and a drink, that type of thing. So there's that fast day. And then the feast day, you can truly do whatever you'd like. So you can, obviously we tell people to be mindful of diet quality. So try to have, fruits and vegetables and less processed foods. But the nice thing about the feast day is that you don't have to count calories at all. So you basically, the cool thing about alternate day fasting, though, even though you have this kind of heavily restrictive day, the fast day, every other day is like a day off of dieting. It's like you can eat normally. You don't have to, you can go to a party, whatever it is. You don't have to be really vigilant with like monitoring calorie intake. So I think that's one of the reasons people like it. And then the second type is called the 5-2 diet. This is kind of popular in the UK, not so much here, but this is a spin-off of alternate day fasting. So this is the second form of intermittent fasting. And it's called 5-2 because it has 2 fast days. So 2 of those like 500 calorie days, and then 5 feast days per week. And you can pick whatever days you want to do the fast days on. So a lot of people pick like Monday and Wednesdays. I definitely recommend to avoid like the weekends if you can. It's just because that's when usually people have that's when they're socializing, that type of thing, parties. Well, pre-COVID or post-COVID, that's usually when parties happen. So it's harder to fast on social days, obviously. And then I'd say the most popular form is time restricted feeding. So this is the third type of intermittent fasting. This is the one that's gotten a lot of attention over the past couple of years. And this is the one where you eat within a certain window of time each day. So it's different from 5-2 and alternate day fasting in that you're fasting a little bit every day. And so you basically pick a window of time. So the most popular form of time restricted feeding, I'd say, is probably the 8-hour diet. And that's when you basically just eat within an 8-hour window each day. And you can pick where you want to put that. So a lot of people I find will pick like 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. because that way you can have kind of like a later breakfast, you can squeeze in lunch and then like an early dinner. So you can still have your 3 meals per day. And then during 6 p.m. to 10 a.m. the next day, then it would just be water fasting. So you eat within, you set your window, say it's 8 hours. You can eat whatever you want during that window. You do not need to count calories. So that's the pretty cool thing about it. You just watch the clock, start when you start, stop when you stop, and then water fast until basically 10 a.m. the next morning or whenever your eating period starts. Another popular one is the 6 hour window. A lot of people choose like 12 p.m. to 6 p.m. for this. So basically, it's really as simple as that. You just pick a time and you do not need to calorie count. You just pick a window, start eating when the window starts, stop eating when the window stops. And what we noticed about my PhD student and I were looking, we went to the bookstore and we noticed that about 4 years ago or so, all these different time restricted feeding books started popping up. There was like literally like a full shelf at Barnes and Noble of just like time restricted feeding, helps with weight loss. It's an amazing diet. And then we went and kind of scoured the literature, the scientific literature, and found that no one had ever actually run a study on whether this diet could help people lose weight. So it's like there's tons of books, and I guess that probably happens in every discipline. But we actually ran the very first study to see if time restricted feeding could help people lose weight. And we chose the window that we chose to test out was the 8 hour diet, just because that one seemed like the most popular one. So yeah, up until this first study that I'm going to show you, really no one had seen if it could actually work, or nobody had actually looked at whether or not it's safe or anything like that. So just to give you kind of a brief rundown of what the study was, it was 12 weeks, so about 3 months or so. And then we had 23 people in the time restricted feeding group. So that's this TRF group here. And again, it was an 8 hour window. So they were eating between 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. Again, to try to squeeze in the 3 meals of the day. And then we compared that to a control group where basically that control group got to eat their usual diet. So, if this was a live session, sometimes I just kind of ask the audience, well, what do you think is a normal eating window in a day? So, from the time people get up to the time people go to sleep, how long do you think that window is? And so the answer to that is actually 14 hours. So there's been studies showing that, yeah, Americans eat for 14 hours throughout the day. There's actually no real meal patterns either. People tend to eat every 2 to 3 hours, like a snack or something to drink, that kind of thing. So we were comparing it to that type of control group where we knew those people were eating within a 14-hour window. And then our intervention group was that we're kind of like knocking out 6 hours. So just reducing it to an 8 hour window. And our hypothesis is really, well, if you shorten your window by that much, you probably have less time to eat all the food you normally would. So then you're like cutting back calories and potentially that could lead to weight loss. So the coolest thing that I just want to reiterate, I already kind of mentioned it briefly, but I think the reason that people really like time restricted feeding more so than the other types of intermittent fasting is because you don't need to count calories. Like with calorie restriction, like traditional dieting, and even with alternate day fasting, you have to kind of vigilantly monitor calories on certain days. And people just get so sick of that. You can't like leave your house and grab an apple or a snack without having to like put it in your app or write it down in your food record. And, people are pretty good at doing that for maybe a month or so. But that's one of the major reasons that people quit diets. They're just so sick of having to like constantly record their calories. So time restricted feeding makes it so simple. All you have to do is watch the clock. Literally, if you have like access to the time, you can do this diet. So the way that we measured adherence, just to see if they were actually eating within that 10 to 6 window, was we gave them these food logs or adherence logs. And they basically wrote down the time that they started and stopped eating every day. And then the study coordinator would just, depending on if they ate within that 10 to 6 window, they would mark that they were adherent or not adherent. And we recorded what they were eating, so the amount of calories consumed using a food record. And I know food records are, for those of you in this in nutrition or some alumni in that area, you know that food records, they're basically the only thing we still have to look at dietary intake, but they're not great. People with obesity tend to underreport calorie consumption by about 20 to 30%. So you may notice that when I'm showing you the calorie data, that it seems a little bit low at baseline. But anyway, we can talk about that more in the question session. But just something, some methodological thing to kind of look at. Look at. Oops. So, to show you some of the study results from this first time restricted feeding study, how was adherence? So, could people actually stick to this 8 hour window over 3 months? And what we found was people could actually do the diet pretty well. So, on about 6 out of 7 days per week, they could do that 8 hour window. They weren't like struggling with it, they didn't find it that hard to do. The day that they didn't do it seemed to be Saturdays. And that's because that's, generally again when like people socialize. So maybe that's why that was the day that, yeah, they weren't really following the diet so well. But yeah, 6 out of 7 days per week, people could follow that 8 hour eating window. And weight loss was honestly, it wasn't as high as we were hoping for. So after 3 months, they lost 2.6% of body weight. And here that equated into about 7 or 8 pounds after 3 months. So nothing crazy, with surgery or weight loss medications, you see much higher weight loss. But we, in terms of a dietary intervention, this was kind of more on the mild to moderate side. With a typical calorie restriction diet or with alternate day fasting, we see more like 13 pounds, so almost like twice the amount of weight loss in 3 months. But time restricted feeding, yeah, the weight loss definitely seems to be slower. But it'll be interesting to see, if this study was carried out for 6 months or 12 months to see if that weight loss would continue. Because people, the one thing I have to say about this diet is people really like it. With alternate day fasting, I have to admit, like most people, they stop the study and they're like, all right, I'm done. That 500 calorie day is driving me nuts. I can't do it anymore. But with this, like we found with time restricted feeding, when we did an exit survey, that 80% of people said that they would continue this eating pattern after the study was over, just because they found it like so easy. Whereas alternate day fasting, only 20% of people say that they're going to continue it. So weight loss is slow, but adherence is the main thing. If you can stick to it for a long time, then potentially, the weight will keep on coming off. And I'd say probably one of the coolest things about this diet, again, there's no calorie counting involved, but just by reducing that window to 8 hours, people ended up cutting out 350 calories per day. So we were right in that they couldn't kind of squeeze in all the food they wanted to, because they were reducing their eating window from probably 14 hours down to 8. So by doing that, yeah, they cut out 350 calories per day. And that's probably why they lost that weight. People don't tend to change just in case I get any questions about like, oh, if you have a smaller window to eat, does that mean you're going to like reach for like more unhealthy foods? Are you going to go for like high fat foods, that type of thing? We've done that sub analysis and we haven't found anything, no changes, even in like caffeine intake or anything. Alcohol intake, all that stuff stays the same. And yes, you can consume alcohol on these diets. I wouldn't, with alternate day fasting, that's the fast feast day one. I wouldn't do it on the fast days just because you only have 500 calories. But with time restricted feeding, sure, women can have one glass of wine per day or one glass of alcohol. Men, it's still two, I believe. So, if that's something that's a part of your lifestyle, I think that's still possible with these diets. We didn't see that many changes, however, in metabolic disease risk factors. So, risk factors for heart disease and diabetes. We did see kind of a slight reduction in systolic blood pressure, but that was pretty much the only change that we saw for disease risk reduction. I think the reason, though, that we didn't see that much of a change, a lot of these people were really healthy at baseline. So their cholesterol levels, triglyceride levels, glucose, all that stuff, if you look here, and if you know what those numbers usually look like, those are all in the normal range. So if somebody's already in the normal range, it's kind of difficult to have to kind of move that to be even better. Another question we often get is, well, is time restricted feeding safe? So a lot of people are concerned about like eating disorder symptoms occurring because, it is fairly restrictive. And then they're also wondering, about that whole hangry thing. Like, am I going to be like super irritable throughout most of the day? Can I not do any exercise like during fasting, that type of thing? So even though I don't actually have any slides on exercise, but we have run a few studies in that area, I do have to say that people can exercise during the fasting window. We people actually get a boost of energy while fasting. You wouldn't think so. You'd think you'd just be like miserable and angry the whole time. But people actually, the first 10 days of the diet are rough, but once you kind of adjust to it, people have this like hyper concentration. They feel very energetic while fasting. And we don't know exactly why that's happening, but it might be related to some like evolutionary thing where like if your body doesn't have food, you're going to be have more energy to go out into your environment and find the food potentially, something like that. But you're not going to feel terrible the whole time, just to reiterate that. In terms of safety, we do measure this with every study, and we just look at different like GI things. So, do people get constipated? That's a major concern. Do people feel neurologically like weak or dizzy or fatigued? And we've actually very rarely seen any of that change over the course of the study. So, definitely in a more recent study, we looked at it week per week instead of just at the beginning and end. And we found that, yeah, there were a couple instances of fatigue and irritability in the first 2 weeks and constipation. But after that, after the first 2 weeks, all that stuff tended to basically disappear versus a control group. So people got adjusted to the diet and didn't really exhibit any adverse effects. Eating disorder symptoms are also something that, that's definitely a concern. I have to say, we don't include people with a history of eating disorders in our studies. I don't think that these diets are probably really that appropriate for people with a history of eating disorders. But we have measured in people without a history of eating disorders are those symptoms going to increase with fasting? And we found that they haven't actually. There was no change in several studies in all these different eating disorder symptoms like depression, binge eating, purgative behavior. So none of that stuff changes in people that don't have a history of that. So at this point, I'd say it does not increase kind of risky eating behaviors or eating disorder symptoms. Another major question we get is, well, won't I be too hungry to sleep? Like, how would if I put my window really early? Um, that I'm going to go, let's say if the eating window for time restricted feeding stops at like, let's say 4 p.m. if you want to put it really early. And if I go to sleep at 11, then I have these 7 hours without eating before sleep. So we kind of looked at, well, how does it affect sleep? And we've run a bunch of different studies in this at this point, but this is kind of what we've seen across the board. So this is a measure of sleep quality. We use a questionnaire to measure sleep quality. And what we did first in that 8 hour time restricted feeding study, we looked at all subjects. So the group as a whole, all of those like 23 people, and we looked at their sleep quality at baseline. So, how to interpret this questionnaire? Basically, a good sleeper is someone that has a score of 5 or below. So, if you have a 5 or below, that means that you're sleeping just fine. So, when we looked at all subjects at baseline, so this dark bar, and then we looked at, can you see the arrow that I'm Okay, great. So baseline and then to week 1, so the first week of the study, and then week 12, we actually didn't see any changes in sleep quality. And then we thought, well, maybe what we need to do is tease out the good sleepers from the poor sleepers. So poor sleepers are people with that sleep quality score above 5. So we separated those people from the people that had a score below 5. And we found, so we called these the good sleepers versus the poor sleepers. And we found that there was still no statistically significant difference. So basically, from this and some other studies, I just didn't want to include everything because I wasn't sure how much time I just didn't want to go over time. In general, time restricted feeding, from what we know so far, does not have any negative effects on sleep. So it doesn't make people, it doesn't increase like insomnia severity or sleep latency, which means like it takes longer to get to sleep. So it doesn't have any negative effects on sleep, but it also doesn't have any positive effects on sleep. We were kind of hoping, because weight loss is associated with some like better sleep scores in general, that maybe it would help people sleep better, but it doesn't. It basically doesn't do anything for sleep from what we can, our lab and what other labs have seen so far. So, but there hasn't actually been a study that just looked at sleep. Most of this is like a sub analysis on the side looking at sleep. So it'll be interesting for future studies to really test this out. So just to summarize what we saw in this first 8-hour time restricted feeding study, yeah, they lost 3% of body weight in 3 months. So that's 7 to 8 pounds in 3 months. People really liked it. They were very adherent. And just by limiting that window to 8 hours, they cut out 350 calories per day. We didn't see much in terms of disease or risk reduction, just some slight decreases in blood pressure. And we also saw, yeah, the diet is safe from that initial study. So the next question is, we were kind of, I have to admit, we were a little disappointed with the amount of weight loss we saw. We thought just because like the diet's so popular that we'd see like amazing weight loss. Like what you really want to see after 3 months is that like 5% weight loss, which is like, just sometimes like 10 to 15 pounds in most people. So we thought, well, why don't we test out a shorter window? Like, why don't we like squeeze out even more time to eat, basically, and see if that results in more weight loss? And also, can people do it? And the reason that we did this is because there's in Silicon Valley, there's this really popular diet called OMAD, the 1 meal a day diet, where people are eating usually within like a 4-hour window or so, from what I can tell. And then another popular one, as well as the 6-hour diet. And again, no studies had actually been conducted to see if these can produce clinically significant weight loss. So so we tested these diets out as well. This was our next time restricted feeding study. So in this one, we compared a 4-hour TRF, so that's time restricted feeding group, to a 6-hour window, and then just again to a control group. This one was a bit shorter, so it was just 2 months long. And then for the actual timing of the meals, it's always, I can definitely foresee getting a lot of questions about this in the question period. So people often ask, well, where should I put that window? I picked my window, 6 hours worked for me, but where should I put it? So it's honestly a really tricky thing to answer, because eating earlier in the day is actually better for you. Your body can process and put away glucose, like sugar, way better in the morning. So if you bombard your body with a lot of food in the morning, it can deal with it. It can like put it away. It knows what to do with it. But if you eat later at night, it doesn't deal with sugar and glucose as well. And you basically become more insulin resistant as the day goes on. So it's definitely healthier to eat early. But we found, I've run like thousands of people through kind of these meal timing interventions. And what I find is that if you ask people to skip dinner, like if we do that really healthy diet where it's like, okay, eat from like 7 a.m. to 2 p.m. or whatever it is, no one's going to do it, because people don't want to skip their family meal, right? They have meals with their families, or they have like nighttime is the time where you like, after work drinks or whatever it is. Like that's the time where people socialize and eat with their families. So for this particular study, if you want to be healthy, I guess to answer the question, put it earlier if you can. But realistically, most people will probably place that window so it kind of captures the dinner time. And that's what we did in this study. We had the 4-hour window be from 3 p.m. to 7 p.m. Again, mainly just so people could eat with their families, because we knew there'd be a high dropout rate if we didn't let them do that. And then the 6-hour window, a bit longer, so 1 p.m. to 7 p.m. And we had about 60 people in this study, and then we randomized them to these 3 different groups. So the 4-hour group, 6-hour group, and the control group. So roughly about 20 per group. And the one thing I want to show you here, this is the study flow chart showing like how many people finished the study. We did have a few dropouts in the time restricted feeding groups, but interestingly, no one dropped out because of the diet itself. So no one was like, oh, this 4 hours is just killing me, I can't do it. So that was really interesting. Admittedly, it's not a huge sample, but it's still Yeah, it's interesting that no one complained about the diet over the 8 weeks. Whereas, again, alternate day fasting, a little harder to stick to. We usually have about a 10% dropout rate, 10 to 20% dropout rate, just because people find that diet kind of hard to do. So, what kind of weight loss did we see with this kind of shorter window study? We saw 3%. So this one was about 8 to 9 pounds, but this one is over 2 months. So I'm assuming that, if this was stretched out to the 3 months, like the 8 hour one, we'd probably see close to like 5% weight loss. So we did see kind of a faster rate of weight loss with these shorter windows. But interestingly, there was no difference between the two groups. So the 4 hour window group lost the same amount of weight roughly as the 6 hour window group. So, kind of a take home message here. You don't have to like torture yourself and shorten it to 4 hours. You can do 6 hours and you'll see the same amount of weight loss. Adherence to the eating windows were actually pretty high as well. So 6 out of 7 days per week, people could do the 4 hour window or the 6 hour window diet. Again, this is just over 2 months, so it'll be interesting to see if that could be maintained long term. We did see with these kind of shorter windows some better improvements in like diabetes risk factors. So we saw fasting insulin go down, insulin resistance also went down in both groups. Blood pressure did not change, however, and we didn't see any effects on like cholesterol levels. But again, that could be because these people had kind of healthy blood pressure and cholesterol at baseline. We also saw a reduction in oxidative stress. So, oxidative stress, I know most of you are alumni in health, from what I understand. So, you probably know what it is. But remember, that's the balance between how many free radicals you have in your body and the amount of compounds you have to kind of like fight against those free radicals, like antioxidants to get rid of them. So, we actually saw that oxidative stress, so potentially free radical production, went down by about 35% with these diets. So that that's positive in terms of potentially like down the road preventing cancer. Obviously, a lot of other tests would have to be done, but that is a nice positive effect. We did not see any effect on inflammation though. We measured TNF alpha and IL-6 for that. In terms of what people were eating, we actually saw with these shorter windows that the reduction in calorie intake was definitely heightened. So, if you remember, with 8 hours, you end up cutting out 350 calories per day. With 4 and 6 hours, we saw the same amount of calorie reduction, but it was closer to 550 calories per day, which again, I think is probably, in my opinion, is the coolest part about these diets. You do not need to count calories and you can reduce, by 500 calories or more just by limiting your eating window. And, for any of you who have tried to cut calories out by calorie counting, reducing 500 calories out of your day is like very difficult, like particularly to try to do it day in and day out. So again, yeah, just find a window that works for you and try it. And you might experience, or you or your patients may experience like a 500 calorie per day reduction. So just to summarize, these shorter eating windows, 4 and 6 hour time restricted feeding. For these ones, yeah, it was more like 8 to 9 pounds weight loss in 2 months. And I'm assuming it'd be, closer to the 12, 13 pounds at 3 months. So that's similar to traditional dieting and alternate day fasting. We do need longer term studies, obviously. Adherence is high. The unintentional calorie restriction that occurs with these shorter windows is about 550 calories per day. And interestingly, the shorter windows do produce decreases in diabetes risk indicators, heart disease risk indicators. So, yeah, they could potentially help with that. I think another question that I'm anticipating getting is, do I think it's the fasting that's helping reduce disease risk, or do I think it's the weight loss? I honestly think it's probably mainly the weight loss. There hasn't been, I know there's a lot of mechanisms postulated for why fasting is helpful, but a lot of these things improve with even minor reductions in body weight. So I think that's the main thing driving these improvements. The other question I often get is, why are people losing weight with intermittent fasting? I think it's just from the calorie reduction. I think, there's a lot of things of like, oh, you're using fats better or whatever. We haven't actually seen that in our lab. The main reason that people are losing it, like I'm a big proponent of calorie in, calorie out. People lose weight because they are just eating less than what they need. So I think that's probably the major thing that's happening with these diets. So I also wanted to talk a little bit about that other form of intermittent fasting, the one called alternate day fasting. So I started studying. This is the first form of intermittent fasting I started studying. I moved into time restricted feeding more recently because I could tell it was very popular and there was like very few studies in that area. But for the first, basically starting in the mid 2000s, we started looking at this diet primarily. So remember, alternate day fasting, that's the one where you have that feast day where you can kind of just eat. Definitely be mindful. You want to make sure your diet quality is fine. It doesn't give you like a carte blanche to just like do whatever you want or anything. But try to eat healthful foods, but you don't have to monitor calorie intake, which is great. And then that's alternated, kind of flip flopped every day with a fast day. And the fast day is that day where you have kind of like a medium sized meal, 500 to 600 calories. A lot of people choose to put that meal as a lunch or as a dinner. But we have run studies and shown that if you want to spread out that 500 calories throughout the day, that's fine too. People tend to lose the same amount of weight no matter like where they put those calories in the day. And so again, yeah, it's really like feast day, fast day indefinitely. That's what alternate day fasting is. So the very first study that we ran, this was published in 2010. The main question we had, because again, like nobody had really tested the efficacy of this diet for weight loss. We wanted to know, well, if you can only eat 500 calories one day, what are you going to do the next day? Like on that day where you can do whatever you want, are you just going to go crazy and like eat 3 times the amount of food that you would naturally eat? So what we found in this initial study and in future studies were that people actually only eat 10% more on that feast day than what they normally would. So they're not binging on the feast day. They're probably eating about 200 calories more. But they alternate day fasting, again, I don't have time to show you all the data, but we do find that it actually helps people control hunger a little bit better. So throughout these diets, people's hunger tend to go down, their fullness tends to go up. So they tend to be a little bit more in control of their appetite. And we're not quite sure why fasting's doing this, but that may help them kind of like not overeat on that feast day. And then I really think that it's really that inability to overeat on the feast day that's resulting in the weight loss. Because they're just not making up for the calories that they didn't eat on the fast day by eating more on the feast day. So yeah, that's kind of what's driving that weight loss. So one of the kind of larger studies that we ran, this is a year-long study, we wanted to find out, well, is fasting better for weight loss than traditional dieting? And I know that question's out there, and maybe people were going to ask that in the question session. So yeah, which one's better? Traditional dieting, where you have to cut out like naturally, or just cut out 500 calories per day by writing it down in food records or an app, or is fasting with like time restricted feeding or alternate day fasting better? The time restricted feeding versus calorie restriction study is still ongoing, so we don't actually have any data just yet. But I will show you what we found for alternate day fasting versus traditional dieting. This study was, again, 12 months long, so it ran for a year. We had an ADF, so that's alternate day fasting group, versus CR, that's a daily calorie restriction, kind of like traditional dieting group, versus a control group. The year-long period was broken down into 6-month weight loss period, followed by a 6-month weight maintenance period. Because another question we had was, well, what do you do once you lost all the weight? Can you use these diets to like continue, keeping that weight off? And so with alternate day fasting, on the fast day, we had them consume 500 calories, so a typical kind of ADF approach. And then during maintenance, we actually had them increase their fast day calories to 1,000. And we did this because we thought that, if we kept them at 500 calorie fast days, they'd probably just continue to lose weight. This was a mistake in retrospect. No one had ever done a maintenance study. So we were just kind of like shooting in the dark. We didn't know what we were doing. But we we made a big mistake. We should have kept them on 500 calories, because you'll see from my next slide, they with 1,000 calories on the fast day, they slowly started like regaining weight with that. So before, kind of basically get a kind of, or I don't, well, hold on. I'll get to my next slide before I explain all this. Calorie restriction diet, we cut out roughly 25% of their needs during the weight loss period. So that's reducing by about 500 calories. And then for their maintenance approach, we tried to teach them how to eat just 100% of their needs. So just, not overshooting what they needed. And then the control group was just like a usual diet. And then, every 6 months or so, we measured like body weight and metabolic disease risk factors. All right. So, to answer the question, does alternate day fasting produce more weight loss than a traditional diet? No, it doesn't. Sadly, this was super depressing, because it took like 5 years to run this study, and like millions of dollars of NIH money, and it's like, whoops, no, it doesn't do anything more. But it does work, so that's great. But does it produce? Is it better than a traditional diet? The answer is no, and this has been shown by other labs as well at this point. So both produced 6% body weight in this study for these individuals. I believe that worked out to be about I think it was like 8 to 10 pounds or so over 6 months. So, and then interestingly, another thing I want to point out is that most of the weight loss occurred in the first 3 months. And this is true for any diet. If you're someone that looks at a lot of like data, weight loss intervention, you're probably familiar with this. But if you're not, whenever you start someone on a diet, all the weight loss really occurs in the first 3 months. And then we always see this kind of like plateauing effect from month 4 to 6. I think people just get burnt out, or maybe their resting metabolic rate kind of readjusts in such a way. But take home message here, if you're a clinician and you're prescribing diets to someone, and if you don't see any weight loss in the first 3 months, it's like probably not going to happen. So that's where you really want to see that kind of plummeting of weight. And then in terms to kind of get back to what I was saying with maintenance, we found that there was no statistically significant change from the body weight here to the end of month 12. So technically, we reported in our manuscript that they maintained weight. But if you look at this realistically, like even though it's not mathematically increased, you can see that their body weight's starting to creep back up. So I think if we were to run this study, say for another year or two, that they would probably regain their weight with this, with the alternate day fasting approach where you're eating 1,000 calories on the fast day. I think one thing we need to run a study seeing, say if they just did maybe 2 to 3 days per week of 500 calorie fast days, maybe that would help them maintain that weight loss. And calorie restriction too, their body weight started creeping back up. Another thing we wanted to look at, well, who does this diet work for? Does it work for everybody? Well, how many people were actually losing weight? And we found that, so these different bars, these are the individual people in the alternate day fasting group. So we had 34 people in this group. And then we just organized these people according to how much weight they lost. So some people gained weight, and then people on this end lost a lot of weight. And what we found was that 20% of people in this group gained weight, whereas about 40% or so lost 1 to 5%. And then another 40% or so lost 5 to 15% of their body weight. So the thing that we wanted to look at is like, well, how does that compare to a traditional diet? And interestingly, we saw almost the exact same effect in the calorie restriction group. 20% gained weight, 40% lost that kind of small 1 to 5% range, and then another 40% roughly lost quite a bit of weight. And interestingly, when we started to tease out, well, who are the responders who do really well with this diet? Postmenopausal women actually do very well, which is shocking because you always hear that after menopause, it's really hard to lose weight. That, to be totally honest, there haven't been a lot of studies for weight loss in postmenopausal women. I'm not sure where that came from. I started doing more of an analysis. They were kind of an ignored group, which is, I'm getting there. But but yeah, now there's finally research trying to see like, is that true? And it turns out it's not. Postmenopausal women actually do better with weight loss interventions. They lost almost twice as much weight as premenopausal women in this study, and we don't know why that is. Maybe it's because they know what diets work for them, so maybe they didn't sign up for the study, or they only signed up because they knew that they would do well with either of these approaches. Also, they may have like more time if they don't have like young children at home, that type of thing, more time to like focus on themselves and their health. um, but anyway, I can answer more questions related to who it works for in the question sessions. I think I'm running. Let me make sure I'm okay on time. Oh, I'm getting a little close here. Okay. So, just to kind of go over with this long term study, we found that, yeah, overall it was 5% weight loss. So, I think that equaled, yeah, around like 10 pounds or so after 12 months in both groups. Fasting does not produce better weight loss than traditional dieting. We didn't see many changes in like lipids or blood pressure, anything like that. Triglycerides went down a little bit more in the fasting group, and LDL cholesterol, the bad cholesterol, went down a little bit more in the calorie restriction group. One thing that we did find as a sub analysis in the study, which I just wanted to point out. So, another question that has been asked is, well, is fasting better for people with pre-diabetes? Can fasting help people prevent the development of type 2 diabetes, basically? So, in this larger study that I just showed you, we teased out all the people with insulin resistance. And you can measure insulin resistance by just multiplying your insulin by your glucose levels from like your annuals. You can just check out what those numbers are and dividing it by 405. If the number is above 2.7, you're insulin resistant. And if it's below that, you're not insulin resistant. So we took all the people that were above 2.7, which was actually a considerable amount. I think it was like 22 out of those like 35 people. And then we looked at, well, does fasting help people that are like basically pre-diabetic lose more weight than daily calorie restriction? And we found no. There was no difference again in weight loss in this like pre-diabetic cohort. The next question we asked, well, does fasting help lower insulin resistance more? And this was a really astonishing finding. We actually found that fasting helped people lower their fasting insulin and HOMA-IR. This is that measure of insulin resistance I just talked about, where you multiply the glucose and insulin. We actually found that fasting decreased insulin and insulin resistance 3 times as much as traditional dieting. So now there's a lot more work in this area that's kind of going on right now, seeing maybe fasting is better to help prevent type 2 diabetes. But again, that needs to be confirmed by a larger trial. So just to finish off now with some practical considerations, who should not do intermittent fasting? Pregnant women and women who are breastfeeding, I don't think, obviously work with your doctor, but it has the potential to reduce milk production. And I wouldn't recommend it in pregnant women. So probably not for those groups. People with binge eating disorders do not do well with alternate day fasting. They do tend to overeat on the feast day. So I would not recommend it for them. Shift workers have a tough time with time restricted feeding and alternate day fasting, just because sometimes their schedules can kind of flip flop around. So they don't tend to do well with these diets. I also find in general, people that are frequent snackers, like somebody that needs to eat every 2 to 3 hours, those people don't do well with fasting in general. The people that do well in our studies are people that their jobs maybe require them to go for long periods of time without eating, like doctors, that type of thing. We're on these like long shifts where you don't really have time to eat. So yeah. And then some other advice. Again, I mentioned it before. The first 10 days are pretty rough. It takes about 10 days to adjust to it. We see all of our dropouts like an alternate day fasting in the first 10 days. So just know that, yeah, the first week and a half is not going to be pleasant, but if you can make it through that, it should be fine. It's going to get way easier. A common complaint is headaches in those first 10 days. It's usually because people are not drinking enough water on their fast day. So up your water intake and the headache should go away. People do feel that boost of energy I mentioned. You're not going to feel kind of like crappy throughout your whole fast day. You're going to feel energized. Your ability to concentrate should not be affected. And for alternate day fasting, we recommend having a higher protein diet on the fast day. Having higher protein helps keep hunger low, so that will help you kind of stick to your calorie goal as well. And then just to conclude, well, which diet should I choose? Alternate day fasting or time restricted feeding? Alternate day fasting, what we found so far, it does produce faster weight loss. So you're looking more at like 10 to 15 pounds in 3 months, but it is harder to follow because you have to like count those calories. Whereas time restricted feeding, it's slower weight loss, somewhere like 5 to 10 pounds in 3 months, but you don't need to count calories. So it's easier to follow and potentially people can stick to it for longer. We just started a 12-month study of time restricted feeding compared to traditional dieting. So 5 years from now, I'll tell you what the results are basically, but we'll see. I just want to thank all my students and postdocs for running all these studies. They're the ones that coordinate all the clinical trials and do all the data analysis. And then also just to thank the National Institutes of Health for funding, as well as Nestle Health Sciences, American Heart Association, University of Illinois as well. And then also just to mention that I have a conflict of interest. I received author fees. I wrote a book on alternate day fasting. It's called The Every Other Day Diet. And basically, it just kind of summarizes all my research in more like lay terms. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you. This has been absolutely fascinating. And really, I want to pause just for a second before questions and say thank you for doing all this incredible research. It was fascinating to hear at the beginning when you said there's books out there and there haven't been clinical trials to actually understand if these things work. So thank you for all the great work that you and your team have done. We do have many questions that are coming in, so our team is trying to summarize them and put them together. But let me start with, there's a lot of questions about what you can consume on a fast day. Vitamins, supplements, chia seeds, coffee with cream. Can you comment a little bit more on what you would recommend people consume on a fast day?
Sure. So with alternate day fasting, when you only have 500 to 600 calories, again, I wouldn't consume alcohol on those days. You can do it on the feast day. Fast days, definitely 50 grams of protein is good. Like if you're thinking about like what kind of meal, we often recommend like a big salad with protein, like chicken or beans of some sort if you're a vegetarian. But you definitely want to have like a lot of like roughage for all the vitamins and minerals. So lots of vegetables and that stuff's so low calorie. And just a little bit of dressing so you don't like overdo it on the calories. And then we get that question all the time about like cream, coffee cream. It's, if you're just putting in like a little bit, it's fine. But I would read, a lot of people are kind of not certain, but there's a lot of, in half and half, there's a lot of calories. So if you're just putting a little bit, that shouldn't really be a problem. Like you don't need to torture yourself, but make sure you're not putting in like half a cup or something.
Mm, Thank you. Uh, Another question, you had mentioned postmenopausal women have success, but there have been other questions about other groups of people. So what about men versus women?
So yeah, we get that question all the time. We haven't found any differences in men versus women, like whether or not they could stick to the diet better. The only thing we've really found is that it seems to work quite well for postmenopausal women.
You'd also touched upon this too, but there was another question about what if you are obese at the beginning versus a normal BMI, with the success rates, and if you can comment a little bit more on that.
Yeah, so we've run studies. Most of them have been in people with obesity, so a BMI of over 30. But we have run studies in normal weight people, and they do benefit from the diet as well. They tend to not lose tons of weight. It's like maybe like half a pound per week type of thing. A lot of athletes use it to get leaner, to kind of reduce their fat mass while maintaining lean mass. So it does work and it does help people, even normal weight people with high cholesterol levels, reduce cholesterol. So we've shown that as well.
Great, thank you. And what about people over 70?
I should have added that to the slide. I don't think it's kind of in terms of like ages, I don't think people over 70 should try it. At that point in people's lives, they tend to start losing a lot of muscle. So they should really work with their doctors to figure out a strategy. Like exercise is probably better than dieting. So we don't want them to lose more muscle mass, and that can happen. Also for kids, I wouldn't recommend it for young children, obviously, but there is a study going on in Australia right now to see if it can work in severely obese teenagers. There's a lot of backlash against it, though, just in terms of like eating disorders. That's a time where people develop eating disorders. So whether or not it's good for teenagers, I can't comment right now. But if you're interested in that, yeah, you can look at the PubMed study. I think it'll be coming out in the next year or so.
Interesting. We've had a few questions from the audience about, can you switch up the fasting hours, or switch from 4 to 6 hours to mid diet? Can you kind of change it as you're in the middle of it? Um,
Yeah, that's a great question. So one thing that we were thinking, another study we are thinking of doing is starting people on like a 4-hour time restricted feeding, maybe for like the first, or sorry, 6 hours, because remember that produces the same amount of weight loss as four. So kind of doing that more like severely restricted, time restricted feeding approach for maybe one, like the first few months, and then kind of easing up on it, like maybe transitioning to 8 hours after a couple months, and then to like 10 hours and seeing if that works for maintenance. The thing is, it's so crazy because like you hear about intermittent fasting all over the internet, but at this point there's only 5 studies that have ever tested the weight loss efficacy of these diets. We've run 2 of them, and some other lab there's 3 other ones, and that's it. You'd think that there'd be like tons of data considering how much people talk about it, but there's not. So I can't give you like a solid answer to anything because the longest study to date has been 3 months. Like our 3 month study is the longest study. So that's why we're running this 12-month study. And then in that study, the 12-month one, we're trying to figure out, can you use it for weight maintenance? We're doing like a 10-hour window for weight maintenance, hoping that will help people. But again, who knows what will happen? It might turn like, just like our alternate day fasting study where we made a mistake and we should have kept them on 8 or something. Who knows?
no, but it's all part of the research and learning what works and what doesn't work. And
Yeah,
um,
exactly.
I know I sort of said this before, but I'm going to say it again because it's a point of pride for UIC. It's incredible that 2 of the 5 studies and that have been under your leadership have been at UIC. So I'm certain people do not know that because it is so popular and talked about widely that people don't understand the science behind it. So
Yeah.
um, another question. How about fasting for Muslims in Ramadan and the Monday and Thursday every week fasting from sunrise to sunset? Is this similar, would you say, to the intermittent fasting program?
Yeah, I think intermittent fasting kind of came from Ramadan. One of my PhD students is from Syria, so I've learned a lot more. I knew a little bit about it, but I didn't understand kind of all the intricacies of it until I started working more with her. But I think I think a lot of this interest comes from Ramadan fasting, where people are, yeah, basically fasting from sun up to sundown. And with Ramadan though, the studies show that you see a little bit of weight loss, but then people tend to kind of gain that back like a month after Ramadan's over. So it's, yeah, I think it stems from that. But whether or not Ramadan, from my understanding, it's a month of celebration. So I think people change their diets a lot too. They might be eating like richer foods and stuff like that. Because from my understanding, when you break the fast at night, a lot of people have like their family over and there's more like celebrations. So I think that could possibly interfere with like weight loss.
Yeah, oh, it's interesting. I know this is not your intent, but I've seen several people saying they purchased your book on Amazon as we've been talking. So
Oh,
it's
thank you.
wonderful so they can learn more. I think we have time for one more question, and this might be a good wrap up question. What would you recommend for maintenance post time restricted feeding?
I think, again, since we're just running the study now, I think I would advise using the 6 or 8 hour window for weight loss. Know that the weight loss is going to be slow, like it might just be half a pound or a pound per week. But I'd probably recommend at this point shifting to like a 10-hour window for maintenance. Because remember, most people are eating within a 14-hour window. So 10 hours is still cutting out 4 hours, which may help people control their calorie intake. But I'm so sorry. Yeah, we don't. We'll know in a few years. But
No, but based on the research now, let me actually sneak in one more question. If somebody that's participating with us today says, I really want to start this and they don't know exactly what the next best for their individual health, is it call your doctor? Is it find a nutritionist? What would you recommend would be sort of a very general next step?
I think if somebody is kind of otherwise healthy and maybe has a few pounds to lose, they could just probably try either. But if you have some type of comorbidity, like if you have diabetes, I would definitely work with a doctor because you'd have to adjust your medications while doing fasting. It can be quite dangerous. Like you can become completely hypoglycemic during fasting. So anyone with type 2 diabetes definitely has to work with a doctor. Otherwise, if you don't have any other kind of major condition, you could probably just try and see which one works for you. You never know. Some people really like alternate day fasting better because they like the fact that they get that free day every other day. That really like keeps them sticking to the diet. Whereas some people like time restricted feeding, so it's just like a little bit every day. So
And
yeah, try.
ultimately, and ultimately, you could try both, right? So I mean, you could try one if that didn't work for you. If it was the restricted, you could switch and see if that was a better.
Exactly, yeah. But just remember they both take 10 days to adjust to. So if you're like miserable, don't quit right away. It's going to work eventually.
No, and I think that's a really important reminder because, like anything, you got to form a habit around it.
Exactly.
And knowing what to expect in those 10 days, you can mentally prepare. Well, thank you so much for this excellent presentation. We're seeing lots of great comments, and just thank you for sharing all of your knowledge. And particularly, again, to you and your team for doing this incredible research. It's just fascinating. I also heard you say that you'd be willing to come back in 5 years or when the research is done and do a part two for us. I don't know if that was an offer, but I'm going to try and twist it.
Yeah, I'm
Um,
happy to come back. We're running several trials all the time. So whenever you need me, I'm happy to update everyone.
Oh, well, thank you. We're so proud that you're on faculty at UIC and working with our incredible students. This has just been a wonderful presentation, and so knowledgeable. Let me just close out by inviting all of you to join us tomorrow on Thursday, January 14th at noon Central Standard Time for our next UIC Alumni Exchange event, which will feature a panel of faculty experts from UIC's College of Education as they present strategies for supporting children and families' social and emotional health during these turbulent times. For information about any of our past episodes, including this one, and information about upcoming programs, please do go to go.uic.edu/alumni exchange. And as I mentioned at the survey at the beginning, you will get a very brief survey. We appreciate you taking the time to fill it out. Thank you again to Dr. Verity for all this wonderful presentation and discussion today. And thank you to all of you for joining us. We look forward to seeing you again, hopefully tomorrow, in the UIC Alumni Exchange. Have a great rest of your day. And again, Happy New Year.